Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Pat, and you're joining me for part 2 of our series on the Amish with a Twist quilt. This pattern is by Nancy Rink, and I've linked below to the site where you can still purchase the pattern if you're interested. The quilt top in the picture was pieced by me using a kit that was available from Nancy Rink at the time that the pattern was released. If you haven't seen part 1 of this series, you can find it using the link below. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. Thanks for joining me, and let's get started. So we're picking up where we left off at the end of part 1 with the log cabin blocks that are just above the center star in this quilt. Again, I'm using the morph tool to help position this design. I can give the computer 4 corner locations using the sew head and the laser, and the computer will stretch the design to fit within that area. This lets me position the design in a way that looks visually correct, even if the quilt is not perfectly straight. Next, I'm going to sew the flowers that go in the outer border section because they use the same thread color that I used in the last block. When I'm using multiple thread colors on one quilt, it's a lot more convenient if I can minimize the number of times I have to change colors and rethread the machine. You'll see I have 2 flowers selected here, and that's because any more than that falls outside of the area that the sewing machine can reach before we advance the quilt. With a dark fabric at the edge of the quilt right next to the exposed batting, I tend to get a lot of fuzz, so I keep a lint roller handy to clean off the quilt when I need to. Now I'm going to sew the same thing on the right border, and of course first I'm going to use the computer to make sure that everything's lined up correctly before I start stitching. Now that I've finished all the sections that I can reach that use the blue thread, I'm going to switch to a purple thread and work on the vines in the inner border. In the area that the machine can currently reach, I can fit 2 repeats of the vine design. When doing these kinds of borders, I'm always careful to move the sew head and laser around just to make sure that everything is going exactly where I want it to. With these vines, the machine is actually sewing the pattern in the reverse direction from how it was originally designed. That way I can start where the previous vines left off, and I don't risk having any fabric bunched up if I were to start from the bottom and work towards the top. So we're going to repeat the same process on the left side. And on this side, the sewing is a little bit farther to the right than I would like, but it's not bad enough to rip out the stitches and start over. Alright, now that we've finished all the blocks in that row, we're ready to advance the quilt a little bit so that we can get access to some newer sections. So when we do this, we have to make sure that the batting stays nice and flat underneath the quilt top, and that everything moves forward smoothly and stays lined up. A handy way to check alignment of the quilt when we move it forward is to move the sew head back and forth just in the horizontal direction, not moving it front to back at all. That helps us look and see if all of the seams are lined up. Once everything's lined up, I'm going to use plenty of pins to hold everything in place. Some people like to use a basting stitch that gets removed later to hold the top batting and back all together while the quilting is happening. I prefer to use pins. I just think it's easier to work with. I'm moving the machine around as I pin because the part of the machine that's under the quilt actually helps me get the tip of the pin back up above the fabric. Now that everything's pinned and we've got the purple thread already in the machine, we can pick up where we left off and continue the vines in the inner border. This time I'm only doing one repeat on each side because it ends at the exact center of the quilt, and that's the point where the vine pattern is going to change direction. So we're done with the purple thread for a little while, and we're going to switch back to the blue color that's in the outside borders as well as the feather part of the log cabin blocks. As you probably recognize by now, we're using the morph tool to position the feather part of the log cabin block that's just to the right of the center. Just like last time, I'm going to use the sew head and the laser to give accurate positions of the four corners, and then the computer stretches the design to fit within that space. I also then take the sew head around the perimeter of the block and I look at the screen and I look at where the laser is on the quilt just so I'm totally sure about where the sewing is going to wind up. Sometimes I'll make some very minor adjustments in position before I start sewing. The really nice part about computerized quilting is that once we've carefully made sure everything's lined up and in the right place, all we have to do is press play and let the computer do the work. On the other side, again, I'm using the laser and the sew head to locate the four corners, and then the morph tool can adjust the design to fit exactly where I want it. This is really important because no matter how good your piecing is, no quilt is exactly square, so it's really important that we check and make sure that the sewing is going to be positioned exactly where we intend it to be. So now we're going to jump over to the outside borders, which use the same blue color thread that we just used in the last block. Again, we're sewing 2 flowers at a time in the outside border because that's what we can reach before we need to advance the quilt further on the frame. And of course, we ran out of bobbin thread right in the middle of the design, so we're going to pause and then reload the bobbin with the same purple thread that we've been using. And the purple thread in the bobbin was chosen again to match the backing fabric that you can see here on the right side of the frame. Every time I reload the bobbin, I need to use this tension gauge to make sure that the bobbin tension is still good and balanced against the top tension. With the bobbin full again, I can now sew the rest of this design. To secure any loose threads, I'll just start backed up a little bit and sew over some of the stitches at the end of where we left off. Next, I get to continue on with the Pebble pattern in the other half of the log cabin block, similar to what you saw in part 1 of this video series. Just like with the adjacent feather design, I'm going to use the morph tool to position the pebbles exactly where they need to be, and then again run the laser around the perimeter just to make sure I'm certain about where everything will wind up. Next, I'm going to work on the crosshatch design that goes in these squares, just like I showed you in part 1. In case you missed that, what I'm doing here is using the laser to measure the locations of all the intersections of these blocks so that our crosshatch pattern will match exactly to the actual quilt. I've used those measured points to create a crosshatch pattern on the computer. You can look back at part 1 if you want to see how that works. Next, I'm going to move over one block to the left and I'm going to stitch the same flower design that we used in part 1. Moving over to the right side of the quilt, I'm going to use the laser again to measure the positions that I need to create the crosshatch pattern for this block. Next, I'm going to sew the same flower design that I used earlier on the left side of the quilt. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do before I start working on the very center of the quilt is to put in the flowers that go in these squares in the border. Thanks again for joining me for part 2 of this series. I hope you're enjoying it. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I look forward to seeing you in part 3, where we get to add some new designs and start working on the very center of the quilt.